That's that one. And we are recording. We are on. So welcome, everyone. We are delighted to have you all here. My name is Donny Lobree.
And I'm Kirk Prine.
And we are delighted to have you with yet another Flesh and Spirit event, Queer Tribes, Conversations with Queer Tribes. Every so often we have a conversation with a queer luminary or thought leader, and to hear some amazing views and visions or ideas about ourselves. And today we are delighted to welcome Brendan Deocariza-Nee. I hope I didn't say it too bad.
You got it. You got it.
Oh, good. So we're delighted to welcome you, Brendan. Welcome. And just to give you a little context, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Brendan so we know. And Brendan is a postulant for holy orders in the Episcopal Church, which is a fancy way of saying that he's preparing to be a priest. He's a survivor of conversion therapy and childhood abuse. Brendan's spiritual work centers on healing religious trauma and helping LGBT+ folks come home to themselves. He serves as a Lay Pastoral Associate at The Vine, which is an emerging faith community within Grace Church in San Francisco. He is also a speaker and facilitator on topics of queer and transgender theology, transformative justice, antiracism, and innovative ministry. Brendan holds a BA in Ethnic Studies from UC San Diego and will embark on a Master of Divinity in fall 2021. Wow, that was a lot to say. In one lifetime, wow.
Welcome aboard. And as you all know, or at least Brendan knows, what we're here to do is just kind of play with three basic questions. One is to hear pretty much, Brendan, your story, your spiritual journey of awakening, and feel free to spend time telling us kind of stories and how you experience things and how your journey has taken you. Part two is just simply talking about, the queer tribe as LGBTQ, et cetera, as we keep adding things, as we keep understanding who we are. But are we a queer tribe? And what does it mean to be a queer tribe? So just hearing a bit of what you muse about, Brendan, and then finally, what's your vision for us? What's your vision for us as a movement, as a people of change? What do you see? And so those are the three things that we're just going to kind of flow through tonight. And I'm going to just start with the first one. So tell us the juicy story of Brendan's life and an awakening on this spiritual path that you're on.
Thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm just delighted to be with you and to be in such good company this evening. Where does my spiritual path start? I suppose it starts at my birth. I was born into a very religious family. My father was raised Roman Catholic and later joined the Episcopal Church in adulthood. My mother was raised staunchly atheist, I would say anti-theist, really. And came into Christianity when she and my father started dating. So I was born within the auspices of the Episcopal Church. I was baptized an Episcopalian. And a few years later, we moved from New York City, where I was born, to a little suburb of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where my father started seminary to join the Episcopal priesthood. I always feel a little bit awkward when I talk about my spiritual journey because it starts with a lot about my parents, but I guess that's sort of appropriate, right? Like these are the people who shaped my understanding of God and religious engagement. So my father became an Episcopal priest, and many folks, if they're familiar with the Episcopal Church at all, might know it as a branch of Christianity that is theologically progressive, that ordains women, that is LGBTQ+ inclusive, We've had a number of amazing presiding bishops who are sort of like the tippy top person within our little corner of Christianity. And then there were people who were, and still are, in the Episcopal Church who do not agree with any of those things. And my father was one of those people. So early 2000s, there was this mass exodus from the Episcopal Church of people who were against the ordination of women, of people who didn't want gay and queer folks to be able to marry in the church, who didn't want gay and queer priests. I don't even think trans folks were on their radar at this point, which is probably a good thing. And my father was really spurred on by two big events in our church. One was the Gene Robinson, the first openly gay bishop, who many of you may be familiar with. And the second was presiding bishop Catherine Jefferts Shorey, who was not only the first woman to be presiding bishop, but also very, very theologically progressive in her own way, and bringing a very different lens of engagement with our Christian scripture. So my father wound up breaking and joining the Anglican Diocese of Bolivia, which was more theologically conservative, not prominent women, not LGBTQ plus inclusive, but more than anything, gave him the opportunity to run a church with very little oversight. You know, the bishop was in Bolivia, we were in Southern California at this point. So he kind of got charge of the ship, without the benefits of hierarchy in terms of oversight or accountability. So those are like the broad strokes that kind of bring you up into middle school, early high school years. But within the midst of these formative events, being baptized in the Episcopal Church, my father being ordained, suddenly not being Episcopalian anymore, being Anglican, which was something I didn't really understand. What was happening within me was this deep formation in a very mystical and traditional and ritualistic, liturgical flavor of Christianity. And I remember being a child at services where we would have all the candles and we would have the incense, and I would sort of get lulled into almost this sleepy, dreamlike state where I was existing within myself, but I was also existing with all of the people around me. And I very much understood myself as one more player in this cosmic story that was unfolding in this way, in these stories that we told each Sunday, in the liturgy we practiced that was handed down to us over so many hundreds of years. And even though I didn't understand all of the concepts that were being foisted on me, and I still don't understand all the concepts that I probably should, what I did take away was that I have this special little place where I get to dwell in the presence of God and where God gets to dwell in me. And I learned how to be in community with people who were seeking the same. I learned what it meant to show up and let myself be changed by the wisdom of my ancestors, spiritual and blood, by the wisdom of the people around me, by our combined energy and consciousness. And these were only words that I had to describe that experience much later in life. But those were the seeds that were being planted. So even in the midst of this environmental turmoil, there was this deeper sense of peace, of belonging, and really yearning to belong to that thing that is bigger than myself. Now, when I was about 12, 13 years old, I realized that I was not straight. And I realized I was not straight because I learned what straight was. And I knew that I was not that. Until that point, my parents had intentionally kept that language from me and my younger brother. So we never condemned gay people because we didn't know gay people existed. It just was not a feature of our lives. It wasn't part of our lexicon. And of all people, the place I learned this was David Bowie. My mother, for some reason, thought that she would give me Ziggy Stardust as a present. So I got very into David Bowie. I got very into the music, and I was watching an interview where he said he was bisexual. So I looked that up on Wikipedia, and I thought, oh, there's a word for this thing that I am that I never knew. I didn't even know there were people who felt this way. And quite innocently, I brought that to my mother because I had never heard this before. I didn't even know it was bad. I didn't know that it was anything. It felt completely value neutral to me. Very, very swiftly, my parents sent me to conversion therapy. And they also sent me to an Exodus International conference, which some of you may be familiar with it. It was quite notorious in its day, but it was essentially an ex-gay conversion therapy organization. And they purported to help people limit or eliminate their same gender attractions. So, with just coming to understand myself as bisexual and not really even knowing what it meant, suddenly I was thrust into this space of being confronted with the clobber passages, in our scriptural tradition, with people who were telling me that, maybe God could still love me, but there was a prescribed path to my life that would make that possible. It felt suddenly like I was balancing on the edge of this knife. And if I bent too far in any one direction, then I was just going to plummet straight into hell. And it really did a number on me psychologically. I didn't grow up in a fire and brimstone kind of church, but suddenly it was all around me. And suddenly that language became very, very popular among the people that I was speaking with and in the language that my parents used with me. And even more than that, what I found in these people who had gone through the ex-gay conversion therapy, who were living in what they deemed as these heterosexual marriages, I saw that they were miserable, to me at least. The stories they told sounded awful. It was not a life that I wanted at all. It was really couched in this language of, we're suffering and it's hard and we're lonely and we don't get the love that other people have, and we've left these partners behind, but we're doing the right thing and our reward is going to be in heaven. And it was around this time that I started to articulate these feelings around what I would later understand as the theology of hell, that there is no amount of human suffering in this life that you can wager against an eternity of punishment. And I really found myself caught hostage in this religion that was telling me I was going to be damned if I continued on the path that I was. And they were the only key to my salvation, but my salvation would come at the price of being miserable forever. Or for as long as I lived on this earth, that I would not have companionship, I would not have love, I would not have sexual satisfaction, I would not have any of these things that straight people got. And conversely, when I was at an Exodus International conference, there was this group of, they were called protesters. I'm not sure how they would conceive of themselves, but they were standing on a corner near the convention center in these, these rainbow tutus and these sparkles and bows in their hair and these big, big smiles. And they weren't angry at all, and they weren't hateful at all. They looked so joyful, and they were holding signs like, you don't need to change. You're perfect just the way you are. God loves you. We'll be ready when you are. And it was so different from this toxicity that I was coming out of in these spaces of conversion therapy. And it didn't feel violent. It didn't feel coercive. It didn't even feel like they thought they were right, so they were trying to, get one over on me. It just felt like this open invitation to a different way of living. And something stuck with me, something kind of buried itself in me from that experience, from these only LGBTQ people that I had seen in the flesh, that there was another way possible. And I was 13, 14, 15. It wasn't in my grasp yet, but I knew that somewhere out there were people like me, and they were happy and they were wearing tutus, and they had glitter, and they had very nice signs. And maybe that could be possible for me one day. And this was something that I buried deeply inside me. And a lot of my teenage years were spent having anxiety, falling into depression, plagued by these nightmares of hell. I mean, it really, with the framework I have now, there were a lot of trauma symptoms that were coming up. And this was compounded by the home environment I was in, which, I mean, let me tell you, conversion therapy is enough of childhood or adolescent abuse, but my parents also had a lot of their own unresolved trauma that they were bringing into their parenting that would have been difficult regardless of the kind of religious paradigm we were acting in. So there were these years of struggle and kind of drifting and wanting to figure out who I was, and also being terrified to figure out who I was, and becoming increasingly suicidal. Just getting to the point where I would spend literally hours a day thinking about how I wanted to kill myself, and then thinking, no, that's going to be really traumatic for whoever finds me. I wonder if there's an ethical way that I can do this that isn't going to put someone in that position, and eventually talking myself out of it. So really, I mean, it brings up this softness in me when I think of it now, because it was this concern for other people that kept me alive, right? Like not wanting to do to someone else what had been done to me, not wanting to saddle them with that trauma and that pain. And this hit a peak in my life, or a boiling point, or however you want to characterize it, when quite accidentally, I learned about transgender people. And I know that may sound silly, that it took me until I was 17 years old, I think. And, you might wonder, in fairness, like we're a 17-year-old growing up, in the US with access to the internet, how did this not come across your radar before then? And it's simply because you can't have the language for something you don't know existed. It was this repeat of realizing that I was bisexual, realizing that I was queer. Suddenly I had language to describe what I had been feeling my entire life. This disconnect between my heart and my body, this feeling like I was wearing someone else's skin, disorienting and not quite a full existence. And as soon as I knew that there was a way to be different, I knew I had to pursue it. There wasn't an option. I had tried to suppress being bisexual. I had tried to suppress, certain political feelings, social justice feelings that I was having. I was trying to suppress my religious questions, all in service of not rocking the boat, of keeping my family, of keeping my place in the community that raised me. And in coming to understand myself as transgender, there was this voice inside me that said, if you don't do this, you're going to die. You're already on the edge, and you have to do this. And it really was almost this Christian idea of, to save your life, you have to lose your life. And I had to bet everything, almost everything, on that voice inside me. I think within a Christian understanding, you could understand that voice as the Holy Spirit. Other people might call it the divine feminine, the higher self. There are many ways to characterize it, but it was that voice of the deepest knowledge, the deepest wisdom, the truest truth inside me that was not recognized by the world around me, but that I knew in my bones had to be true because it resonated so deeply all the way through me. I was eventually kicked out by my parents, not because I was queer or trans, actually, but because we could spend a whole other podcast talking about this. My father started to get radicalized by white supremacist spaces online. And kind of in coming into myself as a queer and trans person and embracing that truth for myself, personally, privately, I also found the need to fight for truth and justice for others, that I was starting to realize I had a place in this world that deserved dignity and deserved respect and justice. And I had to do that for other people too. So we got into horrible fights that eventually culminated in my parents kicking me out quite suddenly at 19. And God, religion was not on my radar for a number of years because I was worried about surviving. You know, I was worried about, okay, how do I get from this stranger's floor that I'm paying $200 to sleep on to a house? Okay, I'm living in a house now. I have roommates. This is better. Okay, never mind. One of my roommates is selling drugs out of the attic. How do I find my own place? Okay, I got my own place. Wait, now I have to pay for my own place. So I was working a lot. I was going to school full time. I was juggling my gender transition. I had started medically transitioning, as well as just, you know, life as a young adult, and also the loss of my family and my church community, which happened virtually overnight. Mm-hmm. And in the midst of all this, there was just that still quiet voice that was saying, you've got to keep going. You just need to keep going. Like, put one foot in front of the other. What's the next thing that you have to do? Mm-hmm. I would call that, again, the voice of God, the Holy Spirit. And it's really what urged me through these years where the only thing was survival. The only thing that mattered to me was, how do I live long enough to enjoy this life that I'm cultivating? And it happened. You know, it was kind of slowly, and then all at once, things started to stabilize. You know, I met my now husband, Evan, and we moved in together. And with his income, suddenly I wasn't having to work as much. You know, suddenly I had time for other things. I had this love in my life. I had his family. I had stability. And it was just this gentle easing into, okay, like this is what it can feel like to be all right, to not worry all the time, to not be looking over my shoulder. And by this point, I was also a couple of years into my gender transition. So I was seeing these physical changes. I could actually recognize the person in the mirror. You know, for so long growing up, if there was a photograph taken of me in a group shot, I would spend at least 10 seconds trying to locate myself because my brain just couldn't recognize the person in the photo. And suddenly I would look at photos of myself. I would look in the mirror, I'd catch my reflection in a window, and I thought, oh yeah, that's me. That's what I look like. That's my real body that this soul gets to live in. And it was such a powerful act of self-creation that I had been birthed into this world once, and then I was birthing myself into being again. And that's what brought me back to the church. You know, this desire that was planted so early in childhood to be part of something bigger than myself. You know, this idea that there's more to the human experience than I can hold in my hands, or that I can recognize in what's materially in front of me. And this was also hastened by the fact that my now husband's family is quite religious and quite devout. And I thought maybe I could score some points with them, even though we're a queer trans couple, if I went to church every Sunday. So it helped the process. And through that, really coming back home to the Episcopal Church, which is where we started going, re-engaging with this liturgy, and finding that in my adulthood, there were people who had the same questions that I had, and there were people who weren't satisfied with easy truths. And there were people who maybe on a good day believed in God, but most days just really felt like they loved Jesus and loved his teachings and loved the people they sat in the pews with. And this whole swath of humanity who gathered together without judgment and without fear and without the need to be right and without the need to assert control over other people, who just wanted to engage with this mystery of being and this mystery of what is God and what is spirit and what might bind us mystically together in this way. And of course, the story doesn't end there. There are so many directions we could go in, and I'm happy to speak more to that. But suffice it to say, I just got caught up in the wonder of it all, you know, in the wondering and in being given the space to wonder and not needing to have easy answers. And through these circuitous paths and these serendipitous connections, finding that I really do resonate with the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. And I really do want to walk this path of love and healing and reconciliation and justice. And that there's something in the words of this man who lived 2,000 years ago in uncertain circumstances, that when I read those on the paper, they just strike at my soul. You know, they light up something in me that I can't explain, and I don't need to explain. And it's enough to know that whatever it is that's getting lit up in me, maybe that's getting lit up in other people. And maybe there's this eternal piece of myself that gets to speak to the eternal piece in someone else. And that's where we can find this connection. And that's where we can have these religious experiences or spiritual experiences or just really good conversations, you know, however we want to couch that language. And that's really what brought me to discerning the priesthood as well, that I realized I wasn't satisfied with just the mundane and material things in life. I absolutely believe that you can be a teacher and a pastor and a healer and not be a priest. I don't think you need to be ordained or have any fancy credentials. But for me, in my Episcopal tradition, there's something that feels so sacred about entering into that line and taking on that responsibility that I will learn our texts and I will learn our traditions and I will learn our rituals and I will pass that along to someone else that maybe they can find healing and freedom too. And I can create spaces where no one has to feel alone and no one has to feel afraid and no one has to feel left out or not good enough. And that's really my dream for how I continue in this spiritual walk and continue to develop my understandings and my practices, that I'm able to carry with me this unburdening of expectation and just this striving for love and truth that really has propelled me along this whole path. So I think I've taken a good bit of time. So thank you all for listening so graciously. And I'll stop there for now on that question.
Speak a little closer to the mic if people are
Okay.
having trouble. Just
Sure. Well, I love hearing people's stories, and I wrote down a few words as you were talking, and I thought, well, how unique is this? You know, so here you are sitting in feeling the presence of the divine in incense and community. And then snapshot 2 I wrote down was here you were being introduced and invited into the queer community with sparkle, glitter, and tutus.
Yeah.
And then item 3 I wrote down was the mirror. You looked in the mirror and finally you saw yourself. And I feel like crying, just hearing what an inclusive journey you have been on, to bring all the parts of yourself together within the context of so many obstacles and challenges, to Yeah, to bring you into this healing space that you are now the healer for yourself, but also holding space for all of us to come into. So thank you so much for that much of the story already, which leads us into second question. So embodied in you is the queer story, as far as I'm concerned. You have brought together all these queer parts and brought them together in such a beautiful being. And do you see us as a queer tribe? Or do you think we're a queer tribe? Or is there such a thing as the queer tribe, or there queer tribes? Or, I mean, everybody who here, no matter what your sexual orientation is, just know that Donny and I think you're queer. Thinking you're queer, meaning that you're outside the boxes, that somehow you're on this path of discovery. So, but for you, are we a queer tribe? Talk about the queer tribe, what that means to you.
To me, the queer tribe is really where I found family outside of my family of origin, where I was able to form kin groups and relationships that were not bound by legality or blood. It's where I learned really how to be myself and what it meant to radically love others. I came of age and mostly grew up in the San Diego area. So when I first came out as queer and then as trans, I immediately found myself among all of these incredibly lovely gay men who never questioned for once whether I had a place among them. And I felt so valued. I felt so cherished. I felt so seen and understood by people who maybe didn't share every part of my story, but who I could tell were willing to reckon with me and to walk alongside me, whatever that meant going forward. Yeah. So really, I do feel the most resonance in those spaces, oftentimes, not always, but in people who, as you said, Kirk, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, are comfortable being outside of the boxes. Don't feel like they have to slot themselves into a particular place. Yeah. And I will add to that, just as nuance or reflection, that although my experience in LGBTQ spaces has been overwhelmingly positive, which is kind of surprising as a trans person, actually, that is not always the case. It's not a shared experience for so many people that we might consider to be in our community. I think of this in small indignities, like people on dating or hookup apps who will put exclusions on the races or ethnicities that they're willing to see, to really big things like trans women of color who are assaulted and murdered at a much higher rate than anyone else in our community. I feel the kinship, I feel the belonging, I feel the relationships, but I also see that that's not reflected across the board. We as this sprawling community, and really, I think, as you've alluded to, it's not just one thing. There's not just one type, but across the many letters of our acronym and those many experiences, there are people who are showing up to the world in different ways, and some of them are quite invested in establishing safety and comfort for themselves at the expense of other members of our community, of saying to the cisgender and straight people of the world, or to those with hegemonic authority, you can trust me and you can reward me because I'm not like those other people. I'm not transgender, I'm not BIPOC, I'm not poor, I'm not mentally ill, I'm a respectable fill in the blank. So that's something that I think about a lot, especially living in the Bay Area, where it is so much easier for many LGBTQ people to find security and to find their place in the world. So I often try to reflect myself on what does that look like for everyone, what experiences are being left out, what stories are being left out, and what can I do to create more inclusive spaces for all members of our community?
Great, great. Yeah. Which is perfect segue into then our vision. So what's your vision for us as queer folk, as a movement? I mean, especially thinking about, we've done a number of calls recently during COVID, and then now, January 6th, the insurrection. I mean, during these very turbulent times, and it's our belief, and none of you on here have to believe anything that I believe, but it's my belief, I should say, that every tribe has its gifts that it brings to the tapestry of healing and wholeness. And we need every tribe's wisdom to make that wholeness happen. So inclusion is something deeply a part of what I hear in you and us. But thinking of us as a movement, or thinking of yourself as part of a movement, what's your vision for us? What are our contributions, or what are the actions that you might feel that Spirit's nudging us into in these times in which we all are living?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I've been thinking about this ever since you asked me that question a couple of weeks ago. When I came of age in queer circles, it was a political term. I think it's queer specifically, to my understanding, has always been political. It's anti-hegemony, it's anti-institution, it's anti the powers that be, which is also very Christian, right? Or should be. So to me, what's the future of being a queer tribe? What is our place in this moment? It's not being afraid to engage with our political power and to assert our identities as political agents, moving through and living in this world. I think this is really obvious when it comes to LGBTQ issues, but could also be spread to a lot of different things. My experience with queer and trans people is that so often we are attuned to the needs and the pains of others. We're sensitive to what it means to be left out of the conversation because we're so often left out of the conversation. So what would it look like for all of us to come together to mobilize that empathy and that compassion and say, we will not stand to tolerate a world in which there are people who are left unhoused, when there's plenty of resources and plenty of housing to go around, where there are children who don't get adequate educations, where there are people who need access to healthcare who don't get it because they don't have money, which isn't real anyway. And I think of this too, like when something that stuck with me as I've been mulling over this question is this whole idea of tribe, right? Brought me to think about the tribe who traditionally occupied the lands of the Bay Area, the Ohlone peoples. And currently in what's now considered the East Bay, there's a group of Ohlone women with this indigenous-led Sogorea Te' Land Trust who are working to rematriate their land. And ask settler occupiers, please pay the Shuni land tax so that we can get back our ancestral lands and have space to do our ritual and have space to cultivate food and medicine and teach our children. And that's not specifically an LGBTQ issue, although of course there are, LGBTQ and Two-Spirit Ohlone peoples and many indigenous peoples. But what would it look like even for those of us who are not indigenous or native, but who are part of the LGBTQ community to say, your struggle is our struggle, and we're going to speak up for you, just like we will speak up for marriage equality, or just like we'll speak up for, access to gender therapy, affirming surgeries. So I don't know, I get very excited about this, and I know we're short on time, but I will cap it there to say that I see the future of our movement as being coalition building, as being collective, as being more than the sum of our parts, and really looking to build that strength and power with other marginalized groups, as well as recognizing the intersectionality in our own experiences.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I'm reminded. Yeah, I got to hear Harry Hay before he died, and he talked about us as queer people in terms of bridge building, and that the fact that we have been born in every generation and time, every family, every race, every creed, every nation, we have been a part of every structure. So therefore, it would seem, he would talk about, that we have in our cellular mass, our spiritual understanding, that we can build bridges to absolutely every community on the earth. And I hear that in what you're saying. It's kind of like, oh yeah, you know, your wounds and your healing have brought you to a vast level of compassion and empathy and heart and inclusion. And doesn't stop with queer folk. But you're anchored in queer folk while doing your mission with everyone, whoever that is and however that calling is expressed. Am I?
Absolutely. Right? Yeah, you said it much more concisely and better than I did.
Great. Thank you. Great. We only have a few more minutes, and I'm looking at the wonderful people that have. I'd love to interview every single one of you, because intuitively my read on just seeing all of you is just like, oh, I'd like to interview you and you, because yeah. Anyway, I feel like it's a wealth of wisdom in this room. But from that wealth of wisdom, ask your questions. So we have a few minutes to open the line. So just raise your hand if you have a question or a comment that you want for Brendan.
And I'll try to see you. Oh yeah, Michael, please. Michael, I saw your hand. Great.
Yeah, listening to your story, I mean, I came out long time ago, and those issues of not having a word for myself and not having an identity. I thought I was going to find a birth certificate that said there was Native American, Black, or Jewish, because that would explain why I didn't even know what gay was. So much of your story resonates with me. But I was treated very brutally by the church, extremely brutally. Almost lost my life, lost my entire family, lost every friend I had in the world, lost my community. So I really struggle. I mean, on my own spiritual path, it's about healing and bridge building. But there are a few issues that I think you might be able to address as far as Christianity that I really struggle with. And one of them is the sort of inherent binary nature of Christian theology: heaven versus hell, God versus Satan. You know, there's this binary thought built into it, which doesn't really go back to Jesus. It goes back to the Roman Empire. But how do you deal with that in your walk within the church?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Michael, and for sharing some of your own story. I went through a period of really intense faith deconstruction that was later followed by reconstruction. So it was really just tearing down so many ideas that I was raised with. And what I came to learn, what I had not known in childhood and adolescence, is that the Christianity inherited by many of us in the US is only about 150 years old, give or take. There are so many strains of Christianity throughout time and throughout the world that look like so many different things, depending on the people who practice it and the time that it's in. So I started exploring some of these theologians who at their time were considered heretics, but now were considered saints, or people who are syncretically tying together Christianity with, Druidry or Buddhism or these other practices, or people who are interpreting Christianity and what it means to be Christian in these radically inclusive ways, anti-binary ways, that use it as a source of going deeper into wisdom and being rather than a source of trying to ascribe rightness or morality. And then also, just speaking for myself, although it's true of other Christians, through this journey and through this learning, I found that I simply couldn't hold a lot of the theology that was given to me as true. I just don't believe in hell. I don't believe it exists. And I don't believe anyone is going there. On my very worst days, maybe I sort of do wish it existed for certain people, but it's just, I don't think it's real.
So
yeah, and so it took a lot of the fear out of it. It took a lot of the punishment out of it, where I had to get myself to a point where I thought I can live a full, happy, complete, satisfied, loving life and never step foot in a church again, and that will be okay, and nothing is going to come to get me. And it was ironically, once I got to that point, that I said, well, maybe I do want to step back in a church again. And I'd be happy to talk with you or anyone in more detail.
I would actually like that very much.
Yeah, please.
I have a minister brother, and I'm trying really hard to build bridges, but there are those certain things that it's like, he tries so hard to be very inclusive and then says like really offensive. Understand. So I would love it if I could.
My email, I believe, is in on the website, but I can also drop it in the chat box. Oh yeah, thank you so much. So great. So it's in the chat now, and anyone is welcome, more than welcome to reach out to me.
Great. We're 2 minutes over, but anybody need to rush out? If not, we'll give you one more chance to ask Brendan a question. Great.
Oh, yes, Irene, please. Thank you.
I just wanted to say I'm one of those, unfortunately, that has to rush out.
No problem.
Thank you for joining us.
Great to have you with us.
Yes,
thank you.
Thank you. Oh, Jamie, would you like to ask a question or?
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question.
Great.
So Brendan, wow, this is really great. And you know what I have a really big issue with, and I don't understand why more gays aren't as horrified about it as I am, or queers, whatever, is conversion therapy. Children who are forced into that. I just like, how can we not be marching about that every day? And I was wondering how you feel about it still going on, even though in a lot of states it's not supposed to be going on. It's still going on.
Yeah, thank you for bringing attention to that. It is horrifying to me. It traumatized me in ways that I did not understand for years. The fact that you can take sometimes literal children, often adolescents who are still at critical stages of development, and tell them that they are wrong simply for existing the way that they exist is psychologically so damaging and creates a dissociation from the core of being that can take years, an entire lifetime to unravel and to come back home into. When I went through conversion therapy in the state of California, it was outlawed. It should not have been happening. It legally was not allowed, as you said. And in so many states, that is the case. There are a few who, through loopholes and clever language are still holding on. I think Utah and Texas are on that list. There are a few others. And I think in my experience, one of the reasons that more people aren't enraged about this is because they don't know what's happening. They think that was a decades past kind of thing, and it was really awful and it was really bad, but that's not where we are now. And I have found that mentality prevalent, in California and other states or regions where folks tend to be more liberal, and more accepting of LGBTQ people generally. I think that the damage of conversion therapy isn't limited to children or adolescents either. And I think it can do great damage to adults who enter into it. So it's I wish I had a better answer for you. The most I can say is that it's terrible, and I try to use my platform to educate people about the fact that this is continuing. You know, this is a continuing problem in our world, and I think the more that we can get voices out there and experiences of survivors out there, then the better opportunity we can raise the critical mass necessary to put an end to it forever.
You're here.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I wish we had hours with you. So many juicy nuggets to unfold and uncover their wisdom. And who was it that just spoke? Jamie. Who just spoke?
Oh, I'm sorry, Stacy. You're right.
No,
I'm sorry. Oh, that was Jamie who spoke.
Jamie. Okay, Jamie. And just Jamie. I'll also know that I was on staff at a Presbyterian Church as the solo token ex-gay. So I too can kind of share a little bit of my experience of healing and moving through that, if that's helpful. So you can also reach me. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. So beloveds, any last comment before we close our time from all of you? This was juicy and lovely, but any last comments from anybody?
You always know a conversation is amazing when you don't want it to end. It's like,
Yes, indeed, I
Thank you
know.
so much. I'm sorry. I feel like I went a little long, but you all are so kind.
No.
This was great.
Yeah, and Brendan, I don't know if you saw the chat just now. You're being asked to write some poetry about your experience.
I used to write poetry. Maybe I'll get back into poetry. There have been some ideas bubbling up. Stacy, you'll be the first to know.
Please do, because I've gotten the privilege of hearing him a couple times kind of sermonizing, and it was like hearing poetry. So I think it's one of your gifts, that you can bring forth some of your wisdom. So thank you so much.
Yes.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for joining us. It's been a joy to see all your faces and have this really robust discussion with Brendan. Brendan, thank you very much, and so many blessings on your path and on your journey to becoming a priest in divinity school. It's just all so exciting.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. And we will be continuing to post queer tribe conversations with new people. So if you want to be on our list, simply sign in. But we're really grateful for all of you for being here. So thank you and namaste.
Namaste, and have a good evening.